Before I begin this story, let me just say, I've always believed that water holds memories, not just reflections. My little house by Whisperwind Lake has been my sanctuary for over 50 years, a place where the water has seen more of my life than any living soul. It saw my husband, bless his heart, teach our daughter to fish. It saw me, countless mornings, watching the sunrise paint the surface gold, a mug of strong coffee in my hands. And recently it saw something I never thought I'd witness. Something that chilled me more than its deepest, coldest currents. My own grandson, Kyler, the boy I'd bounced on my knee, and whose scraped knees I'd patched 1,000 times, pushed me into that very lake. And as I flailed, gasping, genuinely shocked, and for a moment, truly terrified, he stood on the dock, the sunlight glinting off his perfectly styled hair, and laughed. "Don't be so dramatic, Grandma," he called out, his voice, usually so full of that casual, almost bored entitlement, now laced with a cruel amusement. "It's just a little water." He was wrong. It wasn't just water, it was a betrayal. But he was also wrong about me being dramatic, or perhaps not in the way he imagined. Because as the cold seeped into my bones, something else surfaced. A memory sharp and clear from a lifetime ago. U.S. Navy Dive School, San Diego, 1972. A young woman in a sea of men, learning to control her breath, her body, her fear, in the crushing depths. I wasn't just Grandma anymore, I was Petty Officer Miller. And Petty Officer Miller knew exactly how to handle being submerged. This is the story of how I remembered who I was, and how Kyler found out that still waters can, indeed, run very, very deep, especially when you've just shoved your 76-year-old, ex-Navy diver grandmother into them. He's currently trying to explain his version of a little water to Sheriff Brody. Me? I'm right here on my porch, wrapped in a warm blanket, sipping a cup of Earl Grey, the strong, sweet kind, just the way I like it. And let me tell you, it tastes like peace. The day had started like any other late spring morning at the lake. The mist was burning off the water, revealing the glassy surface that mirrored the tall pines on the opposite shore. I'd had my usual breakfast. Half a grapefruit, a piece of whole wheat toast with a thin smear of marmalade, and that first glorious cup of coffee. Kyler had arrived the evening before, a surprise visit, he'd called it. Surprise indeed. He rarely ventured out from the city unless he wanted something. My daughter, his mother, Sarah, had called a few days prior, a hesitant tone in her voice. "Kyler might drop by, Mom. He he has some ideas he wants to discuss with you about the house." Ideas. I knew what that meant. Kyler, bless his ambitious heart, saw this house not as a home filled with memories, but as prime lakeside real estate. A teardown, he'd probably call it, to be replaced by some monstrous glass and steel box that would sell for a fortune, a sliver of which might, if I were lucky, fund a comfortable room in a facility of his choosing. He was 26, working for some flashy development company, and convinced he knew everything about everything, especially how older people should live their twilight years, quietly, out of sight, and preferably not occupying valuable assets. We'd had a stilted dinner. I'd made his favorite pot roast, the way I used to when he was a gangly teenager with an insatiable appetite. He'd picked at it, scrolling through his phone, occasionally making comments about the potential of the property. "You know, Grandma," he'd said, looking out at the lake, "this view alone is worth a mint. We could really maximize its value." I'd merely nodded, sipping my iced tea, the clinking of the cubes in my glass, the only sound for a moment. The old me, the one before the slow, creeping realization of his intentions, might have gently argued, might have spoken of sentimental value, of legacy. But I'd seen a hardness in his eyes that evening, a dismissive glint that told me my feelings were irrelevant, quaint obstacles to his grand plans. The morning of the incident, he'd been restless, pacing the small living room, then wandering out to the old wooden dock. I'd been tending my small rose garden near the porch, the scent of peace roses, my favorite, perfuming the air. He called out, "Grandma, come look at this." The old mooring needs repair, see? I'd put down my trowel, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked towards him, a familiar sense of unease settling in my stomach. He was standing near the edge, looking down into the water. The lake was deep there, dropping off sharply. I'd always warned him, even as a child, to be careful. I stood beside him, peering down. The mooring chain was indeed rusty, but it wasn't in imminent danger of failing. "It looks all right for now, Kyler," I said. "I'll have Mr. Henderson take a look next time he's over." He turned to me then, a strange, tight smile on his face. "Or," he said, his voice suddenly different, "we could just get rid of all this old stuff, start fresh." And then, it happened. One moment I was looking at the water, the next I felt a firm, decisive shove in the small of my back. The shock was a physical blow, a sudden, brutal expulsion of air from my lungs as I hit the surprisingly cold water. For an instant, pure, animal panic clawed at me. My glasses flew off, sinking into the murky green. The world became a blurred, chilling chaos. My cardigan, already heavy, began to absorb water, dragging me down. I gasped, swallowing a mouthful of lake water, tasting algae and something metallic like fear itself. My arms flailed, uncoordinated, instinctive movements of a drowning creature. And then, through the panic, I heard his laugh. That terrible, dismissive laugh, followed by those words, "Don't be so dramatic, Grandma, dramatic." The word cut through the cold, through the fear, like a shard of ice to my heart. He thought this was a game? A joke? Or worse, a calculated move to frighten me, to assert his dominance, to show me how helpless I truly was? In that moment, something snapped, or rather, something clicked into place. A lifetime of suppressed fire, of quiet endurance, flared into a cold, hard resolve. The Navy. Dive school. The endless drills, the instructors screaming until their faces were purple, pushing us beyond what we thought were our limits. Control your breathing, control your mind, control the water. Lieutenant Commander Pike, a man whose face seemed permanently carved from granite, used to roar. "Panic is your enemy. The water is your friend if you respect it, if you understand it." And just like that, 60-odd years of civilian life, of being a wife, a mother, a grandmother, peeled away, and the training surged back, as visceral and immediate as if it were yesterday. I stopped flailing. The first rule, conserve energy. The second, control your buoyancy. I consciously let the remaining air hiss from my lungs. It was counterintuitive to anyone fighting for the surface. But I wasn't fighting for his surface, not anymore. I was going to a different surface, one of my own choosing. As I began to sink, a strange calm descended. The cold was still intense, but it was no longer a chaotic enemy. It was a fact, a condition to be managed. My limbs, though stiff with age and the sudden immersion, remembered the old movements. I angled my body, using my legs in a surprisingly effective frog kick, my arms sculling gently to propel me downwards and away from the spot where I'd entered. The water pressure increased against my eardrums, a familiar discomfort. I swallowed, equalizing. The light from above grew dimmer, filtered, greenish-brown. I knew this part of the lake. Under the dock, it was cluttered with old pylons, shadows, and debris. Perfect cover. My plan was forming, crystallizing with every beat of my determined heart. He wanted drama? I'd give him a performance he'd never forget. But the finale wouldn't be my sputtering resurfacing. It would be his dawning, horrified realization. I wouldn't just swim to shore. No, that was too simple, too quick. I'd disappear. My descent felt slow, deliberate, each movement measured. The wool of my cardigan was a sodden weight, but I focused past it. My sensible walking shoes, usually a comfort, felt like anchors, but they too served a purpose now, helping me sink. I remembered the training exercises in the murky waters of the San Diego Bay, the visibility near zero, relying on touch, on memory, on the feel of the current. This lake was clearer than that, but still, without my glasses, everything was a watercolor blur of greens and browns. I focused on the silhouette of the dock pilings against the slightly brighter water towards the shore. My target was the far side of the T-shaped dock, the section that extended parallel to the shoreline, where a thick bed of reeds and cattails grew right up to the edge. It was a place Kyler would never expect me to reach, if he even bothered to look for more than a few seconds. He probably imagined I'd pop up, gasping and indignant, right where I'd gone in. The arrogance of youth, I thought, a bitter taste mixing with the lake water in my mouth. Sarah, my daughter, knew vaguely about my Navy years, but I'd never been one to boast or dwell on the past. It was a chapter, a significant one, but just one among many. Perhaps I should have shared more, I mused, as I swam with slow, powerful strokes, conserving every ounce of energy. Perhaps if Kyler had known I wasn't just some frail old lady, he might have thought twice. But then, would he have? His greed, his utter self-absorption, seemed to eclipse everything else. Reaching the underside of the dock was like entering a shadowy underworld. The sounds from above were muffled, distorted, his footsteps pacing, a faint, impatient sigh. I moved carefully, feeling my way along the slimy wood of the pilings, avoiding snags, keeping my profile low. The water was colder here, out of the direct sun. My teeth began to chatter, a faint, uncontrollable tremor. I clamped my jaw shut. Not now. Focus. I needed to get to the reeds. The distance wasn't great, perhaps 20–25 feet underwater, but it felt like miles. Each foot gained a small victory against the cold, against the drag of my clothes, against the burning in my lungs, which I was carefully managing, exhaling slowly, conserving that precious CO2 tolerance built up so long ago. I could feel the beginnings of a cramp in my left calf. I flexed my foot, working it out, refusing to let it disable me. The image of Kyler's laughing face was a constant, burning goad. It fueled me, kept the shivers at bay, sharpened my resolve. Finally, my outstretched hand brushed against the tough, fibrous stalks of cattails. I'd made it. Carefully, slowly, I maneuvered myself amongst them, finding a spot where the water was shallower, perhaps only chest deep if I were to stand, but I remained submerged, my head just below the surface, tilted so I could break water with minimal disturbance if I needed a quick breath. The reeds were thick, a natural screen. I parted them ever so slightly, just enough to peer out. The view was perfect. I could see the end of the dock, Kyler standing there, his back to me now, looking out over the open water where I had disappeared. He was still there, right where I'd left him, if left him was the right term for being forcibly ejected from his presence. From my vantage point, nestled amongst the rustling reeds, the water chilling me to the bone, but my anger a surprisingly effective internal furnace, I watched. At first, his posture was casual, almost nonchalant. He had his phone out, probably scrolling, I thought, with a fresh wave of bitterness. The audacity. He pushes his grandmother into a lake and then checks his social media. For a good 5 minutes, maybe more. Time underwater has a funny way of stretching and compressing. He just stood there. He'd occasionally glance at the spot where I'd gone under. A flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher from this distance, perhaps a fleeting impatience. Honestly, Grandma, I could almost hear him muttering, "Stop this foolishness." Then, slowly, I saw a change. He put his phone away. He walked to the very edge of the dock, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Grandma?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly over the water. It wasn't loud, not yet. More annoyed than alarmed. "All right, very funny. Come on out now." Silence, except for the lapping of water against the pilings and the whisper of the wind in the pines. I remained perfectly still, only my eyes moving, tracking him. He paced a little, a short, jerky back and forth. "Grandma, this isn't amusing anymore." His voice was sharper now, a distinct edge of irritation. He peered intently at the water, his head moving from side to side as if he could will me to appear. Another minute passed. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning coolness in the air, though not for me. I could feel the cold seeping deeper now, a real concern, but the show, as they say, had to go on. And then I saw it, the first real crack in his composure. He ran a hand through his perfectly gelled hair, messing it up. A small gesture, but telling. His confident stance faltered. He bent down, closer to the water's surface. "Grandma, seriously, where are you?" There was a quaver in his voice now. The amusement was gone, replaced by a dawning unease. It was a truly remarkable transformation to witness, like watching a statue slowly begin to sweat. He started to look around more frantically, up and down the shoreline near the dock, his gaze sweeping past my hiding spot without a pause. Of course, why would he look there? I was supposed to be helpless, old, probably clinging to a piling right where I fell in, if I hadn't already sunk like a stone. The thought that I might have actually swum somewhere, executed a plan, was clearly beyond his comprehension. This was the Kyler I knew, so wrapped up in his own perceived superiority that he couldn't imagine competence or resilience in someone he'd already dismissed. His pacing became more agitated. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't scrolling. He held it to his ear. Was he calling someone? His mother, perhaps? Or 911? The thought sent a small, grim pulse of satisfaction through me. Good. Let him explain this. Let him try to make "she was being dramatic" sound reasonable when there was no sign of me. The laughter was long gone. His face, even from this distance, looked pale. He was starting to look like a cornered animal. The hunter was becoming the hunted, though he didn't know his prey was watching his every move, coolly, calmly, from the reeds. The irony was not lost on me, even as I fought back another wave of shivers. The sound of a boat engine starting up somewhere down the lake was the next thing that broke the quiet tension of Kyler's increasingly frantic vigil. It was old Mr. Henderson, I guessed, probably heading out to check his fishing lines. Kyler's head snapped up, his eyes darting towards the sound, a flicker of desperate hope in his expression. But Henderson's little boat chugged off in the opposite direction, oblivious. Kyler let out a frustrated sound, a groan that carried across the water. He was starting to unravel, piece by piece. He shouted my name again. "Grandma! Martha!" His voice cracked on my name, a raw edge of panic now undeniable. It was strange hearing my given name shouted with such desperation from his lips. He hadn't called me Martha since he was a tiny boy struggling with the word grandmother. The shift was significant. He was no longer playing a game. He was facing a void, a terrible possibility of his own making. He started to look truly scared. He ran to the end of the dock, then back towards the shore, then back to the end again, like a caged animal. He even got down on his hands and knees at one point, peering into the murky water, his reflection staring back at him, distorted and anxious. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The water was indeed holding a reflection, and it wasn't a pleasant one for him. He finally did what I suspected he might. He yelled, truly yelled, "Help! Somebody help! My grandma! She fell in the lake!" His voice was hoarse, strained. That was interesting. She fell. Not I pushed her. The revisionist history was already beginning. I filed that away. It wasn't long before his shouts attracted attention. I saw Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor from 2 houses down, emerge onto her porch, shielding her eyes against the sun. She was a kind woman, a retired nurse, always ready with a casserole or a concerned question. "Kyler? Is that you, dear? What's wrong?" she called out, her voice full of concern. Kyler rushed to the edge of my property line, waving his arms. "It's my grandma. She was on the dock and she slipped. I can't find her." He was gasping for breath, putting on quite the performance of the distressed grandson. If I hadn't known better, I might have almost believed him. Mrs. Peterson, bless her practical heart, didn't waste time. "Oh dear Lord, stay there, Kyler. I'm calling 911 right now." I heard the faint click of her screen door as she hurried back inside. Kyler returned to the dock, his agitation at fever pitch. He kept looking at the water, then up at the sky, then back at the water, as if expecting me to miraculously levitate. The wait for the authorities felt interminable, even for me, hidden and shivering but in control. For Kyler, it must have been an eternity of dawning horror. He paced, he muttered to himself. He occasionally shouted my name again, though with less force now, more a despairing plea. I watched him, a cold knot in my own stomach, not of fear, but of a profound sadness for the boy he used to be, and a steely resolve for the man he had shown himself to be. The distant wail of a siren, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, was the signal that the next act of this drama was about to begin. Kyler heard it too. He froze, his head cocked, listening. His shoulders sagged. The fight seemed to go out of him, replaced by a kind of terrified resignation. He knew, I think, that things were about to get very, very real. The arrival of the sheriff's car, lights flashing silently as it crunched onto the gravel of my driveway, was a moment of grim punctuation. Sheriff Brody, a man I'd known since he was a boy himself, stealing apples from Old Man Hemlock's orchard, climbed out. He was older now, lines etched around his eyes, but he still had that same steady, no-nonsense air about him. He was accompanied by a younger deputy, serious-faced and efficient. Kyler met them halfway up the lawn, his words tumbling out in a rush. She was on the dock. I think she might have had a dizzy spell, she just fell in. I tried to reach her, but... He trailed off, gesturing vaguely towards the water, his face a mask of carefully constructed anguish. From my reedy hideaway I could hear most of it, the wind carrying his words. He was a decent actor, I'd give him that. Sheriff Brody listened patiently, his gaze fixed on Kyler, occasionally nodding. Mrs. Peterson had joined them, wringing her hands, offering details about how she'd heard Kyler shouting. "He sounded so distraught, Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling a little. "Poor Martha. She's not as steady on her feet as she used to be. I felt a pang of guilt for the worry I was causing Mrs. Peterson, but it was a necessary casualty of this unfolding lesson. The deputy was already heading towards the dock, his movements brisk and professional. He had a life ring in his hand. Sheriff Brody asked Kyler a few more questions. "When exactly did this happen, son?" About 20 minutes ago, maybe half an hour? I don't know. I lost track of time. I was looking for her." His voice hitched conveniently. "Did you see her go under? Did she call out?" Brody's tone was calm, but there was an underlying sharpness. "It happened so fast," Kyler stammered. "One minute she was there, the next, just a splash. I shouted for her, but nothing." He conveniently omitted the part about me flailing, about his laughter, about his charming, "don't be so dramatic" comment. I watched the deputy scan the water, his eyes methodical. He called out my name a few times. "Martha Collins, can you hear me?" Of course I could. But Martha Collins, the supposedly frail old lady, was currently indisposed, observing the proceedings with a rather critical eye. The sheriff walked down to the dock himself, Kyler trailing behind him like a miserable shadow. Brody peered into the water, his expression grim. He spoke to the deputy in low tones, and I saw the deputy nod and get on his radio, likely calling for a dive team or a boat patrol. This was escalating just as I'd anticipated. Kyler stood a little apart, hugging himself, shivering theatrically, though the sun was quite warm now. He kept glancing towards the house, then back at the water, his eyes wide and haunted. Was he thinking about inheritance now? Or was the fear of actual consequences finally starting to penetrate his thick skull? Sheriff Brody turned back to Kyler. "Was there anyone else here? Did anyone see anything?" "No, just me," Kyler said, his voice barely a whisper. "We were just talking." "Talking about what?" Brody asked, his voice deceptively mild. Kyler hesitated. "Oh, you know, just things. The house, the future." He was vague, evasive. I could see Brody file that away. The gears were turning in that shrewd mind of his. He knew my grandson, knew of his city ambitions, knew I wasn't one for dizzy spells that conveniently led to me falling off my own dock. The tension was palpable. I knew I couldn't stay hidden in the reeds indefinitely. The cold was becoming a serious issue, my limbs were stiffening, and the shivers were harder to control. but the timing had to be perfect. I needed to let Kyler dig himself in a little deeper, let the weight of his lies settle upon him. The deputy was talking about dragging operations, about search patterns. The words hung heavy in the air. Kyler looked like he was going to be sick. Yes, I thought, just a little longer. Let him contemplate the full spectrum of what he'd done. The moment felt right, charged with a grim sort of electricity. The deputy was on the radio, requesting more resources, his voice professionally detached as he described the situation. Elderly female, submerged, unknown time. Kyler was standing near the edge of the dock, staring blankly at the water, the picture of despair. Sheriff Brody was watching him, a thoughtful, almost predatory stillness about him. It was time for my resurrection. I took a slow, deep breath, as deep as I could manage with my head mostly submerged, and then, with a steady, controlled movement, I pushed myself up through the reeds. I made sure it wasn't a sudden, gasping emergence. No, I rose slowly, like Venus from the clamshell, if Venus were 76, dripping lake water and thoroughly unimpressed. I parted the reeds with a deliberate rustle, loud enough to draw attention. The first to see me was the deputy. His eyes widened, his jaw literally dropped, and he fumbled with his radio. Sheriff. Hold on a second. Sheriff Brody turned, his gaze sweeping from the deputy to where I was now standing, chest deep in the water, a few feet from the dock's edge, calmly pushing wet strands of hair from my face. Kyler. Kyler didn't see me at first. He was still lost in his own dark tableau. It was Mrs. Peterson, who had ventured closer to the water's edge, who gasped, "Martha! Oh my heavens, Martha! You're alive!" Her cry, sharp with shock and relief, finally pierced Kyler's self-absorption. He spun around, his face. Oh, if I live to be 100, I will never forget the look on his face. It was a bizarre cocktail of utter disbelief, stark terror, and then, dawning, horrified comprehension. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. No sound came out. He went white, then a sickly green. For a moment, I thought he might actually faint and fall into the lake himself, which would have been a truly ironic twist. I took a couple of steps towards the dock, the reeds parting before me. "Good morning, Sheriff Brody," I said, my voice a little shaky from the cold, but surprisingly firm. "Kyler, fancy meeting you all here." Sheriff Brody recovered quickly. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, quickly suppressed into professional neutrality, but I saw the twinkle in his eyes. "Martha," he said, his voice laced with suppressed astonishment. Are you all right?" "A bit chilled, Sheriff," I replied, "but otherwise surprisingly resilient. It seems I'm harder to get rid of than some people imagine." I looked directly at Kyler as I said that last part. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He was still speechless, his eyes darting between me, dripping and very much alive, and the spot on the dock where he'd last seen me, or rather, where he'd pushed me. The narrative he'd been constructing, the one of the tragic accident, was crumbling before his very eyes. "Grandma?" He finally choked out, his voice a strangled whisper. "But how? I saw you. You went under." "Yes, dear, I did," I said calmly, beginning to wade towards the shallower part near the small, pebbled beach beside the dock. "And you were so kind as to comment on my dramatic flair or lack thereof. I decided to take your advice and try for a more understated performance." The deputy helped me out of the water, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and dawning respect. "Mrs. Peterson rushed forward with a towel she'd apparently fetched, clucking like a mother hen. "Martha, you'll catch your death." Sheriff Brody, however, was all business, though the amusement still lingered in his eyes. He looked from me to Kyler, who now looked like he was about to throw up. "Kyler," Brody said, his voice suddenly hard, all traces of neighborly concern gone. "You said she slipped. You said you tried to reach her," Kyler stammered. I thought she did. I mean, he couldn't meet my gaze. He couldn't meet the sheriff's gaze. He was trapped." The carefully woven tapestry of Kyler's lies began to unravel with astonishing speed. Once I was wrapped in a couple of thick towels, courtesy of a still flustered Mrs. Peterson, and seated on one of my wicker porch chairs that the deputy thoughtfully brought down to the lake's edge, Sheriff Brody turned his full attention back to my grandson. "So, Kyler," Brody began, his voice deceptively gentle, "Martha here seems to be telling a slightly different story than 'she slipped.' Why don't you tell me what really happened on that dock?" Kyler was a mess. His face was ashen, his expensive haircut was now disheveled from his own agitated hands, and he was visibly trembling, though not, I suspected, from cold. He kept glancing at me, a desperate, cornered look in his eyes. I don't know what she's talking about," he stammered, his voice weak. "She must be confused. The shock, the cold water. Confused?" I interjected, my voice clear and steady, despite the shivers that were now racking my body. "Kyler dear, I might be old, but my memory is perfectly intact. And what I remember, quite vividly, is your hands on my back shoving me. I also recall you laughing and telling me not to be so dramatic while I was, for all you knew, drowning." Kyler flinched. "No! I wouldn't. Why would I do that?" "That," Sheriff Brody said, his eyes narrowing, "is an excellent question, Kyler. Why would you do that?" He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "Mrs. Collins, did you happen to get a sense of why your grandson might want to expedite your departure from this world?" Before I could answer, Kyler blurted out, "It was an accident, I swear. We were horsing around. I bumped her. I didn't mean for her to fall in." "Horsing around?" I raised an eyebrow. At 76, Kyler, my horsing around days are long behind me, and that was no bump. That was a deliberate, forceful push. You even said, just before, something about getting rid of all this old stuff, starting fresh. Were you referring to the mooring, Kyler, or to me? His face crumpled. He looked wildly from me to the sheriff, then to Mrs. Peterson, who was watching with wide, horrified eyes. The sympathetic, neighborly expression she'd worn earlier was rapidly being replaced by one of dawning disgust. "She's twisting things," Kyler insisted, his voice rising in panic. "She's always been dramatic." There was that word again. "Dramatic enough to fake my own drowning, perhaps," I conceded mildly. "But not confused, Kyler. You see, Sheriff, my grandson has been rather keen on me selling this house. He has plans. Big plans. I suspect my continued presence here was becoming something of an inconvenience." Sheriff Brody nodded slowly. "We had a call from your mother, Martha, a few days ago, Sarah. She mentioned Kyler was coming up to discuss the property, sounded a bit worried about his approach. Kyler looked like he'd been slapped. His own mother had, in her way, flagged him. The net was tightening. And that comment about being dramatic, Kyler?" Brody continued, his gaze unwavering. "Did you say that while she was in the water?" Kyler opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew. He knew I wouldn't have brought it up if it weren't true, and perhaps he even dimly recalled Mrs. Peterson being within earshot earlier, though he wouldn't know if she'd heard that specific comment. He was trapped by his own callous words. I might have said something. I was panicking." He tried, a last desperate attempt. "Panicking?" I asked, my voice soft but carrying. "You were laughing, Kyler. I heard you quite clearly before I decided to take a little underwater tour of the dock pilings. Funny thing, perspective. Gives you a whole new angle on things." I then explained, briefly and concisely, about my Navy training. "Dive School, 1972, Sheriff. They teach you a few things about staying calm under pressure. And underwater, I let the air out of my lungs, sank, and swam to the reeds. I've been watching the whole show from there." The deputy, who had been listening intently, let out a low whistle. Kyler just stared at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and a new kind of fear, the fear of someone who has profoundly, catastrophically underestimated their opponent. The image of his frail, easily manipulated grandmother was shattering before his eyes, replaced by a woman who had coolly outmaneuvered him at every turn. He had no more lies left. The truth, stark and ugly, was all that remained. The immediate aftermath was a blur of quiet efficiency on the part of Sheriff Brody and his deputy, and a vortex of rapidly collapsing bravado on Kyler's crupple. Brody calmly informed Kyler that he was being taken in for questioning regarding a possible assault, reckless endangerment, and potentially, given his earlier statements, attempted coercion related to property. Kyler started to babble then, a torrent of excuses, apologies, and pleas. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Grandma, please tell them I didn't mean it. I was stressed. The pressure from work, from Dad. He looked at me, his eyes begging. I met his gaze, my expression unreadable, I hoped. Kyler, I said, my voice devoid of the warmth he was so desperately seeking. Actions have consequences. You made a choice, several in fact. Mrs. Peterson, ever practical, had hurried back to her house and returned with a thick, warm robe for me, and then discreetly busied herself making a pot of tea in my kitchen. The deputy gently but firmly guided Kyler towards the patrol car. The fight had completely drained out of him. He looked like a deflated balloon, his expensive clothes rumpled, his face streaked with what might have been actual tears this time, or perhaps just sweat. As they reached the car, he turned for one last look at me, a look of utter desolation. I simply held his gaze. No anger, no triumph, just a profound and weary disappointment. The sheriff stayed behind for a few moments, taking a more detailed statement from me. Martha, he said, shaking his head slightly, a reluctant admiration in his eyes. You are one hell of a woman. Navy dive school, huh? I wouldn't have guessed. We all have our hidden depths, Sheriff, I replied, managing a small, tired smile. He asked if I wanted to press full charges. I told him I needed to think about it, but that his department should proceed as they saw fit based on the evidence and Kyler's actions. He needs to understand the gravity of what he did. I said, this wasn't a childish prank. No, ma'am, it wasn't, Brody agreed grimly. He promised to have someone call my daughter, Sarah. The thought of that conversation made my heart ache. Sarah would be devastated, torn between her son and her mother, but this wasn't something I could shield her from. Kyler had brought this storm upon all of us. Once the sheriff had departed, the flashing lights receding down my driveway, an almost unnatural quiet descended upon the lakeside. Mrs. Peterson emerged from my kitchen bearing a tray with a steaming teapot, 2 cups, milk, and sugar. Thought you could use this, dear, she said softly, her earlier shock replaced by a quiet, supportive sympathy. And perhaps a bit of company? I nodded gratefully. We sat on the porch, the scene of so much recent turmoil, and she poured the tea. I cupped the warm mug in my hands, the porcelain radiating a comforting heat through my still-chilled fingers. The Earl Grey was strong and fragrant. I took a sip. It was, as I'd thought earlier, the taste of peace, but also of a hard-won justice. The view across the lake was serene again, the water sparkling, oblivious to the human drama it had witnessed. But I knew, and Kyler now knew, that the water held more than just reflections. It held truth, it held consequences, and for me, it held a reaffirmation of a strength I had perhaps allowed to lie dormant for too long. Kyler was on his way to the station to explain his actions. His, "Don't be so dramatic," would sound very different in a formal interrogation room. My drama was over, his was just beginning. The days that followed were a strange mixture of quiet routine and unsettling ripples from Kyler's disastrous actions. Sarah, my daughter, arrived the next morning, her face etched with worry and a deep, painful confusion. The phone call from Sheriff Brody had obviously shaken her to her core. We sat on the porch, the same spot where I'd enjoyed my tea of vindication, and I told her everything, leaving out no detail of Kyler's callousness, nor of my calculated response. She wept, not loudly, but with the quiet, heartbreaking sobs of a mother whose child has profoundly disappointed her, and who also fears for her own mother. "I don't understand, Mom," she whispered, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. How could he? Why would he? I didn't have all the answers for her, only the ones Kyler himself had provided through his greed and impatience. He saw the house, Sarah, I said gently. He saw an asset, not a home, and I suppose I was an obstacle. We talked for hours. She was torn naturally. Kyler was her son, despite everything. But she also saw the undeniable truth of his actions, the cruelty he had displayed. There was no defending him pushing me into the lake, no matter how he tried to spin it later as a misunderstanding or a moment of madness to his mother. The legal proceedings moved forward. Kyler, after a night in a holding cell and a rather unpleasant arraignment, was released on bail, paid by his increasingly distressed father. His parents hired a lawyer, a slick city type named Mr. Placed, Joe, from Leyte St. Sigzerida. Davies, who, I heard, tried to suggest I was perhaps suffering from early onset dementia and had imagined the whole thing, or had perhaps even fallen in accidentally and concocted the story to gain attention. My own lawyer, Monica, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd had the foresight to consult some years ago when I updated my will, quickly disabused Mr. Davies of that notion. My clear recollection of events, Mrs. Peterson's testimony about Kyler's initial shouts for help claiming I'd slipped, and Kyler's own conflicting statements to the sheriff made his case incredibly weak. The mention of my Navy dive school background also seemed to throw a rather large wrench into their frail, confused old lady narrative. News travels fast in a small community, and even faster when it involves a dramatic lakeside rescue and a grandson's shocking betrayal. There were whispers, of course, sympathetic glances from familiar faces at the grocery store, a few extra casseroles left on my doorstep. Mr. Henderson, who'd been out fishing that morning, even stopped by to say he'd always thought that Kyler boy was a bit too smooth for his own good. The support was quiet but firm. Kyler, I heard through Sarah, was miserable. He was facing serious charges, assault on an elderly person, reckless endangerment. His high-powered job was suddenly on hold, his reputation in tatters amongst anyone who knew the real story. His parents were arguing constantly. The grand future he had envisioned, built on the quick sale of my lakeside property, had evaporated. He was confined to the city, part of his bail conditions, and was apparently alternating between sulking and panicking. I found a strange sort of peace settling over me. The initial anger had cooled, leaving behind a resolute calm. I hadn't sought revenge, not really. I had sought justice, and perhaps more importantly, I had sought to reclaim my own dignity, to prove that I was not to be dismissed or endangered. I spent my days tending my roses, reading, and watching the lake. The water no longer felt like a site of trauma, but a silent, powerful ally. It had tested me, and I had, in my own way, passed. I had faced down a threat, not with physical force, but with the strength of my mind and the echoes of a training long past. The house felt more mine than ever. The threat of its loss had receded, replaced by a renewed appreciation for its quiet comfort, its history, its enduring presence in my life. It was more than just an asset, it was my anchor. The legal process dragged on, as these things often do. Kyler's lawyer, Mr. Davies, tried various tactics. He requested psychiatric evaluations for me, which Monica expertly shut down, providing instead a glowing letter from my longtime physician, Dr. Evans, attesting to my sharp mental acuity. He attempted to discredit Mrs. Peterson's account of Kyler's initial cries of, "She slipped," suggesting she misheard. But Mrs. Peterson, a retired nurse with a mind like a steel trap, remained unshakably consistent in her testimony. The local prosecutor, a young woman named Miss Albright, was thorough and determined. She saw Kyler for what he was, an entitled young man who had committed a dangerous and cruel act against his own grandmother. My brief but impactful statement about my Navy training and my deliberate actions underwater became a cornerstone of the prosecution's narrative, highlighting the calculated nature of Kyler's act versus his claim of a mere accident or panic. He had time to reflect, to reconsider, while I was supposedly drowning. His choice was to laugh, That resonated. Sarah visited me often. Our conversations were difficult but necessary. She was slowly coming to terms with the person her son had revealed himself to be. There was immense grief in her, and a quiet anger, too, directed not at me, but at Kyler, for the pain he had inflicted on everyone, including himself. He always got what he wanted, she said one afternoon, staring out at the lake. We, we spoiled him, I suppose. We never made him face real consequences. Well, I replied gently, he's facing them now. The case eventually went to a plea bargain. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a jury trial where his actions would be laid bare in excruciating detail, Kyler, on the advice of Mr. Place, by Vave the Fashion Havental, and after call, where in excruciating detail, Lom Stadi I, of Lom Stadi on, Lom and an evidence and the prospect of a jury trial where his actions would be laid. Davies pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. He avoided jail time, much to my initial private disappointment, but received a lengthy probation, mandatory anger management counseling, a significant fine, and a court order to stay away from me and my property. He also had to write a formal letter of apology, though Monica warned me it would likely be crafted by his lawyer and devoid of genuine remorse. She was right. The letter arrived a few weeks later, a stilted, formulaic expression of regret for the distress caused. I read it once and then used it to light the kindling in my fireplace. Some apologies are best offered in person, with sincerity or not at all. The real consequence for Kyler, I think, was the implosion of his world. His dream job vanished. His social standing, at least among those who knew the truth, plummeted. His relationship with his parents was strained to the breaking point. He had, in his attempt to seize an asset, lost far more than he could ever have gained. For me, life settled into a new rhythm. The quiet of the lake was deeper, more resonant. My little house felt safer, more secure, not because of locks or alarms, but because I had rediscovered a strength within myself that I had almost forgotten. I was no longer just Martha Collins, the quiet widow. I was Martha Collins, the woman who had faced down betrayal and emerged, not unscathed but unbroken. I reconnected with a few old Navy friends, women I hadn't spoken to in years. Sharing my story with them, even in edited form, brought a sense of camaraderie and validation. They, of all people, understood the mindset, the training, the refusal to be a victim. Mrs. Peterson and I became closer, our shared experience forging a bond. We'd often have tea on my porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in fiery colors. The memory of Kyler's laughter still sent a shiver down my spine sometimes, but it was fainter now, overlaid with the stronger memory of my own resilience and the quiet satisfaction of justice served, not hot and vengeful, but cold, clear, and deep as the lake itself. I had my home, my peace, and my dignity all intact. And Kyler? He had his consequences. And perhaps, just perhaps, a very long time to think about the true meaning of being dramatic.